We've all heard the amazing story of Easy Company and Major Winters.
Many an hour has been whiled away by military history fans watching Band of Brothers, learning of Easy Company's journey from Camp Toccoa, Georgia, to Normandy for D-Day, to Holland, then on to the Battle of the Bulge, and finally into Germany. But did you know that the US Airborne saw some intense fighting in the Pacific Theatre too? This isn't a well-known story, so join us as we tell you about the US 11th Airborne and the Los Baños raid. You can forget about Saving Private Ryan, because this is one of the most daring rescue missions of the Second World War. The US 101st and 82nd Airbornes are two of the most famous airborne divisions of the Second World War, mainly due to the emphasis placed on D-Day and the war in Northwest Europe. The 11th Airborne is very much unknown to most, however, they trained alongside the 101st Airborne at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, where the infamous Currahee Mountain is located. First activated on the 23rd of February 1943, the 11th Airborne consisted of 1 parachute and 2 glider infantry regiments. Held in reserve for the first half of 1944, in June the division was transferred to the Pacific Theatre of Operations. Upon arrival, the 11th was thrown into an intense program of training and acclimatization, and by November was designated combat ready. They would go on to take part in one of the most daring rescue missions of the Second World War, the Los Baños raid. Being the only airborne division out of 5 the US had mobilized in the Pacific during the Second World War, this story is often overlooked. However, General Colin Powell, former United States Secretary of State, said of this raid,
"I doubt that any airborne unit in the world will ever be able to rival the Los Baños prison raid. It is a textbook operation for all ages and all armies."
So what was this raid all about? Since the US landings at the Laysan Gulf and Nasubu on the 9th of January 1945 and the 31st of January 1945 to retake Luzon, the Japanese army was being repeatedly pushed back and was becoming increasingly desperate. Not long after the landings, news was emerging that the Japanese were executing civilians and prisoners of war when falling back. American General Douglas MacArthur was extremely distressed about the fate of thousands of prisoners who had been interned by the Japanese, and was worried that with the liberation of Japanese-held islands so close, thousands of prisoners' lives were at risk. Something had to be done. 64 miles southeast of Manila in the Philippines, a large number of civilian prisoners had been detained in an internment camp with appalling conditions. This was located on the campus of the Agricultural College of the Philippines at Los Baños. The camp was located between the foothills of Mount Makiling and the northern shore of Los Baños, facing Laguna de Bay. Construction had begun in May of 1943, when the first 800 prisoners arrived at Los Baños. A further 200 inmates arrived from the University of Santo Tomas internment camp, followed by 500 in April 1944, and 150 in December. Contained by barbed wire fences were British, American, Australians, Norwegians, Dutch, Poles, Italians, and Canadians. Apart from 11 US Navy nurses, under the command of Chief Nurse Laura M. Cobb, and a handful of servicemen, the majority of the prisoners were civilian businessmen, teachers, missionaries, and bankers, all captured by the Japanese throughout the war in the Pacific. Conditions in the camp were deteriorating rapidly. Dwindling rations and clothing, coupled with poor housing and almost no sanitation, was only made worse by sadistic camp guards. Conditions took yet another downward turn in early 1945, thanks to the camp's second in command, Warrant Officer Tadaki Konishi. On the 3rd of February 1945, the 11th Airborne Division, under Major General Joseph Swing, jumped into Tagaytay Ridge. On the same day, they were tasked with the mission to rescue the prisoners from Los Baños, about 20 miles behind the Japanese lines. Due to heavy sporadic fighting with the Japanese, immediate deployment was not possible, so Major General Swing ordered the formation of a plan to be carried out at the earliest possible moment. The plan would be carried out in 4 phases. Phase 1. The 11th Airborne's Provisional Reconnaissance Platoon, under the command of First Lieutenant General Scout, coupled with 20 Filipino guerrilla guides, would make their way behind enemy lines by bankers, local fishing boats, across Laguna Lake 2 nights prior to the raid, and would lie in wait. Then 4 assault teams would assault the camp gate from various angles. At 7 AM on the 23rd of February, they would be tasked with making the drop zones, landing zones, and for the neutralisation of the camp gate guards, alongside an attack from the remaining directions by guerrillas of the 45th Hunter Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Inglis, who would also surround the entire camp perimeter prior to 7 AM. During Phase 2, B Company 1st Battalion 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led by Lieutenant John Ringler, with support from Lieutenant Walter Hettinger's machine gun platoon, would parachute into a small drop zone adjacent to the camp, rendezvous with the guerrilla unit, dispose of the remaining camp guards, and secure the internees. The rest of 1st Battalion would board 54 LVTs, tracked amphibious assault vehicles, from the 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion at 4 AM, and make their way into Laguna de Bay and move towards Mayondon Point, near San Antonio, about 2 miles from the camp. Subsequently, a recon platoon under Sergeant Leonard Hahn would identify and guide 1st Battalion to the landing point. They would travel overland and make their way into the camp to arrive just after 7 AM. They would then move the prisoners back to Mayondon Point and make their escape to Mamative Village. Phase 4 comprised of the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment minus its 2nd Battalion and C Company of the 637th Tank Destroyer Battalion, coupled with the units of the 472nd and 675th Field Artillery Battalions under Colonel Robert H. Soule. The force would make their way down Highway 1 to act as a diversion and to engage the Japanese 8th Division, if needs be, to protect the flank. Additional guerrilla units, such as the 48th Chinese Squadron, would set up roadblocks in Kowloon, Bay, and Bila to block the route of the Japanese reinforcements. The Hunters ROTC 47th Regiment would also do the same in Calamba, Pansol. All surrounding routes to the camp would be secured, with the backup of the 11th Airborne's pack howitzers. Finally, locals were informed of the attack and asked to evacuate Los Baños by elements of the PQOG Home Guard. On the 21st of February 1945, in the dark of night, a 31-men platoon left the west side of Laguna de Bay, heading across the bay in 3 bancas, closely followed by an assault team of 23 men. Carefully avoiding Japanese patrol boats, they landed near Nahaya and met with local guerrillas, with the addition of a small number of camp escapees at the local schoolhouse. 2 of these escapees, Freddie Zavalakos and Benjamin Edwards, used the schoolhouse's blackboard to sketch out the layout of the camp. Lieutenant Scow split his men into 6 teams, with several guerrillas assigned to each. Edwards and Zavalakos each accompanied 1 team. During the night of the 21st of February, they made their way through the jungle and the rice paddies to the camp. At 4 AM on the 23rd, 1st Battalion 511 Parachute Infantry Regiment minus B Company boarded 54 Amtraks and headed through Laguna de Bay towards Mayondon Point. This was a success, with the Japanese unaware of their presence. They proceeded to cover the final 2 miles overland, towards the camp, arriving just after 7 AM. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Ringler's B Company, coupled with the light machine gun platoon, had spent the night in Nichols Field, where at dawn they loaded into 9 C-47s of the 75th Troop Carrier Squadron under Major Don Anderson to make the short flight to their drop zone. With no opposition from Japanese aircraft or anti-aircraft guns, they soon reached their drop zone, which had been marked with green smoke by the recon platoon. The recon platoon, under Lieutenant Scow and Sergeants Angus, Cool and Tao, then disposed of the guards on the camp gates on the north and northwest side of the camp, with the addition of the Hunters guerrillas, mopping up any survivors. At 7 AM, Lieutenant Ringler's paratroops dropped from their C-47s at 500 feet. B Company proceeded to charge down the camp 15 minutes after the attack commenced, entering the camp compound through the holes in the fence cut by the scouts. The Japanese were soon overwhelmed, and the firefight was short-lived. The prisoners were finally free. The 54 Amtraks of the 672nd Amphibious Battalion proceeded to come ashore in 9 columns of 6 vehicles, after green smoke was used to mark San Antonio Beach by Sergeant Hahn and Marking's guerrillas at 6:58 am. Finally, the Amtracs led by Burgess proceeded to the camp, knocking out a pillbox on the way. Recognising the need for swift evacuation, Ringler and his men began rounding up the prisoners as quickly as possible. However, some prisoners refused to evacuate, so Ringler's men burned the remaining huts in the camp to try and encourage them to load onto the Amtraks. Priority for loading was given to the disabled, women, and children. The rest of the prisoners formed a column and made their way to the beach. Heavy distant gunfire was heard from across the lake. This was Seoul's task force. Prior to the rescue, the diversionary force of the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment, coupled with C Company of the 637th Tank Destroyer Battalion, 472nd and 675th Field Artillery Battalions, had headed as planned up Highway 1, and had attacked across the San Juan River. Intense fighting erupted when they'd made contact with the Japanese, near the La Chorrera Hills, where casualties had occurred. By mid-morning, however, the resistance had been dealt with, and they made their way towards Los Baños, where they cut off the road between the Japanese 8th Division and Los Baños. From Seoul's high-up position, he could see the Amtraks en route to Mammoth Village. He proceeded to withdraw his troops back to the bridgehead across the San Juan River. Finally, at 3 p.m, the last Amtrak successfully evacuated the last prisoners to Mammoth Village. Amongst the rescue prisoners was Frank Buckles, who was a civilian who had been captured in Manila. Frank had served in the previous war, and amazingly, went on to become the oldest surviving American First World War veteran. The amazing success of the Los Baños raid incorporated many components which revolutionized generations of special military operations. Its effective planning, intelligence gathering, surprise, speed, and use of friendly forces meant that this textbook operation resulted in very few casualties for the Americans. However, it did come at a cost. Not long after the evacuation, the escaped Sadaki Konishi returned to Los Baños. Observing there was not a POW to be seen, the Japanese anger was directed at the civilians of the town, who had not followed the guerrillas' warnings to leave prior to the raid. With help from pro-Japanese militant group Makapili, 1,500 civilians were executed, and the village was burnt to the ground. After the war, Konishi was arrested for this act, tried, found guilty, and executed for war crimes.